The neighborhood was still, a curated silence broken only by the rustling of perfectly trimmed hedges that lined the streets of Willow Creek Estates. This was the kind of community where lawns were measured, mailboxes had regulations, and even the type of welcome mat one placed on their doorstep had to be approved by a committee. It was a place where appearances mattered more than anything, and the Homeowners Association, particularly its chairwoman, Karen, made sure of that. I had been away for 2 weeks, a much-needed escape to the mountains to recharge, to leave behind the constant scrutiny and nitpicking of an HOA that had grown more invasive with each passing month. No one was supposed to know I was coming back early. My plan had been simple: return quietly, check on the house, and enjoy a few days of solitude before the expected return date. But in a community like Willow Creek, nothing went unnoticed. The black SUV eased through the community gate, the keypad still warm from my fingers entering the code. I noticed immediately how every corner of the street seemed cleaner than usual, the way fresh lines of mulch outlined each property. Karen must have had one of her infamous, emergency beautification mandates, while I was gone. It wouldn't surprise me. She thrived on control, on orchestrating the neighborhood like a puppet master pulling invisible strings. As I pulled into the driveway of my mansion, a sprawling, modernized estate that stood out from the cookie-cutter facades that flanked it, I couldn't help but notice the twitching curtains from across the street. Karen's house, of course. Her ever-watchful eyes never rested, even in the middle of a weekday. It was as if she had a sixth sense for when someone was about to disrupt the carefully maintained illusion of order she cherished. I stepped out, luggage in hand, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. There was something unnerving about the stillness. Not a single car moved on the street, not a single leaf seemed out of place. I unlocked the front door and carried my things inside, savoring the familiar scent of my home. But even then, there was that lingering feeling of being observed, like a hawk circling its prey. Upstairs, I checked the security system. The cameras had been recording while I was away, as they always did, and everything seemed intact. Yet, a series of notifications blinked on the screen: movement detected near the side gate, around the back patio, and, strangely, at the front door several times during the nights I was supposed to be away. Karen had a spare key to no one's house but acted like she owned the entire block. I wouldn't put it past her to inspect properties when residents were gone. It was part of her so-called neighborhood safety checks, a thinly veiled excuse to snoop. I was unpacking when I heard it, a knock on the door. No, not just a knock. It was sharp, deliberate, insistent. I glanced at the time, 4:32 p.m. I hadn't even been home for an hour. Through the peephole, I saw her. Karen, clipboard in hand, her lips pursed into that familiar thin line that promised confrontation. I didn't open the door. Not yet. Instead, I stepped back, letting her stand there. She stayed for several minutes before retreating, at least, I thought she had. Half an hour later, the distant wail of sirens broke the eerie calm. Red and blue lights reflected off the glossy finish of my garage door. 2 police cars pulled up, their tires skimming the curb with practiced precision. My stomach tightened. I hadn't done anything wrong. I hadn't broken any laws. But in a neighborhood like this, suspicion was often enough. Through the blinds, I saw her again, Karen, standing across the street with her arms folded, pointing toward my house as if orchestrating the scene. She was talking to one of the officers, her expression a mix of false concern and quiet triumph. This was no random patrol. She had called them. The officers approached, knocking loudly, their hands hovering near their belts, their voices firm as they announced themselves. They were here because someone, Karen, had convinced them something was wrong. That I was an intruder. Or that something illegal was happening behind my closed doors. My early return had triggered her, disrupted her sense of control over the narrative of the neighborhood. In her mind, I wasn't supposed to be here yet, so the only logical explanation, for someone like her, was that I wasn't supposed to be here at all. The officers circled the property, peering into windows, their flashlights cutting through the dimming evening light. Neighbors began to gather in small clusters along the street, whispering, their curiosity feeding off Karen's theatrics. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was a spectacle, a show for the bored, rule-abiding masses who lived for gossip. I stood silently inside, watching the scene unfold, my mind racing through the possibilities. If I opened the door, it would validate her interference, make it seem like she had a reason to act. If I didn't, the situation might escalate further. Either way, Karen had already planted the seed. I was suspicious, I was out of place, I was the problem. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had evidence, plenty of it, of her overstepping boundaries, of her using her HOA position not as a means to protect the neighborhood but as a weapon to control it. My early return had given me an unexpected opportunity. As the officers radioed in, Karen paced the sidewalk like a general on the battlefield, her finger darting in my direction with every word. Her voice carried across the manicured lawns, just enough for fragments to reach my ears, not supposed to be, break-in, security concern. And as the flashing lights painted the night, I realized this was only the beginning. Because if Karen thought she could get away with this, she was in for a rude awakening. The next move would have to be careful, deliberate, and perfectly timed. I turned away from the window, letting the blinds fall shut as the murmurs outside grew louder. My plan began to take shape, one step at a time. Tomorrow, the neighborhood would wake up to a very different kind of drama. The night after Karen's dramatic display had been long and restless. The distant hum of the street lamps outside my window seemed louder than usual, and every passing car felt like a deliberate stakeout. The neighborhood had tasted scandal, and like sharks circling a drop of blood in the water, they weren't about to let it dissipate so easily. By morning, the spectacle had transformed into whispers. Joggers slowed their pace as they passed my property, their eyes darting between the mansion's tall windows and the wall leader's house across the street. Social media groups for the neighborhood, usually filled with lost pet notices and yard sale announcements, buzzed with veiled questions about the unfamiliar vehicle seen entering after hours, and potential break-in concerns. Karen had crafted her narrative overnight, painting my early return as suspicious and perhaps even unlawful. She had called the cops not to protect the neighborhood, but to assert dominance over it. In her world, no one acted without her knowing. My early arrival was, to her, a breach of protocol, an insult to her control. And so, her reaction had been swift and public, a theater of flashing lights and stern officers meant to remind everyone that she was the gatekeeper of order. What she hadn't anticipated was my own preparation. The cameras installed across my property had captured everything, the officers circling, Karen gesturing wildly, her repeated statements that she had reason to believe the property was being occupied illegally. Even the moment where she lingered on my side gate, phone in hand, snapping photos like a private investigator desperate for a lead. I reviewed the footage over coffee, each clip adding weight to the growing file on my desktop labeled simply, HOA, evidence. But evidence alone was never enough in a place like this. Reputation ruled supreme, and Karen's had been carefully polished over the years like one of the neighborhood's ornamental garden statues. To challenge her openly would mean declaring war, and wars in communities like Willow Creek were fought in layers, whispers, committee meetings, official notices, and when all else failed, legal paperwork. By noon, an envelope arrived on my doorstep. No postage, just a pristine white slip tucked beneath the welcome mat, stamped with the HOA seal. A violation notice. According to Karen and her committee, my early return had violated two clauses: failure to notify extended absence return date, and unapproved overnight parking of a non-registered vehicle. It was absurd. My own car, parked in my own driveway, during my own residency, yet here it was, written in the language of bureaucracy to make it seem like an infraction. The true meaning of the notice was clear: I was being warned. Not officially, not in a way that would hold up in any real legal sense, but in the manner Karen preferred, through intimidation and paperwork that looked far more legitimate than it was. I considered my options as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the perfectly aligned hedgerows. I could ignore it, let her think she'd won the opening round, and continue as if nothing had happened. Or I could push back, begin to unravel her carefully woven net of influence thread by thread. The neighborhood was already tense from the previous night's drama. Parents watched from porches, pretending to supervise their children while really keeping their eyes on my property. Elderly neighbors stood in their driveways with their morning papers, deliberately turning pages slower, hoping to catch a glimpse of what might unfold. Karen, of course, had positioned herself as the vigilant protector, standing in her yard more than usual, phone always in hand. That evening, I made a point of walking the perimeter of my property, clipboard in hand, mirroring her own methods. Every camera, every motion light, every inch of fence was accounted for. I knew that if she had the audacity to involve the police over a harmless early return, it would not end there. There would be escalation, and escalation came sooner than expected. Just as the neighborhood settled into its twilight lull, the HOA newsletter was released electronically. Its language was cautious but unmistakable. Recent incidents of unauthorized occupancy, it read, have raised concerns regarding the safety and integrity of our community. Residents are reminded to inform the board of any unusual comings and goings and to report suspicious activity without delay. The newsletter was Karen's way of deputizing the entire block. Now, every curtain twitch, every porch light flicker, every passing car would be another set of eyes against me. She had turned my return into a witch hunt, and her goal was clear: isolate me, corner me, and force me into submission or departure. But what she didn't realize was that I had no intention of leaving. This was my home, my property, and my right to live without the oppressive shadow of her false authority. The next morning, I began making calls. Not to the HOA, but to the county property office, to the legal team that had helped draft my initial deed agreements, and to a few key residents I knew were quietly frustrated with Karen's reign. One by one, they listened. Some were hesitant, afraid of the social consequences of opposing her, but others were ready to see her power checked. That afternoon, as Karen paraded her dog past my driveway for the third time, phone camera angled just enough to capture my license plate, I uploaded the footage from the previous night to a secure drive. The police presence, the unauthorized photos, the newsletter that had no legal basis. All of it was forming a case, not just for me, but for every resident who had endured her unnecessary surveillance. There was no need for an explosive confrontation yet, not while the stage was still being set. But the seeds were sown, and the first cracks in her carefully curated facade were beginning to show. Neighbors who once waved at her now exchanged glances instead. A couple across the street asked, in hushed tones, why she had involved the police without proper evidence. A younger resident posted anonymously online, questioning the HOA's motives in turning the neighborhood into a surveillance zone. Karen, of course, responded by doubling down. More patrols, more notices, more thinly veiled threats. But the more she pushed, the more the narrative began to shift, not entirely, but enough to suggest that her grip on the community was slipping. And I was ready to give it that final push. What she thought was an intruder had been the homeowner all along. What she thought was a show of power had been her public misstep. Tomorrow, the board meeting would be held. And tomorrow, the footage would speak louder than any accusation she could muster. The night before the meeting, I stood at my window, lights dimmed, watching her house across the street. Its porch light flickered as though unsure whether to stay on or off, a fitting symbol of her uncertain hold over Willow Creek. The game had only just begun, and Karen had made her first and most critical mistake: she had underestimated who she was dealing with. The morning of the HOA board meeting dawned with an unsettling stillness, the kind that precedes a storm no weather report dares predict. The entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath as the sun rose over the immaculate cul-de-sacs of Willow Creek Estates. Cars remained parked with military precision, lawns gleamed from their recent trimming, and every porch flag fluttered just enough to give the illusion of normalcy. But beneath that polished surface, a quiet anticipation simmered. Karen had prepared for this day as if it were a coronation. Her house, directly across from mine, bustled with visitors, the usual circle of loyalists, clipboard carriers, and self-appointed enforcers of community standards. They came and went with papers tucked under their arms and expressions of self-importance etched into their faces. It was clear she was planning to present the board meeting as a spectacle, a platform to reinforce her narrative and cement her authority once more. But today, the script would not be hers to control. I arrived at the community hall early, my presence alone enough to draw a cluster of curious onlookers. The whispers began immediately, low and charged with the weight of speculation. The story of my early return and the police incident had grown its own legs over the past 2 days, reshaped by each retelling until it no longer resembled the truth. Some believed I was hiding something. Others quietly suspected Karen had overstepped. All were eager for resolution. The board convened in their usual manner, seated at the long mahogany table that was meant to inspire seriousness but more often facilitated pettiness. Karen sat at the center, gavel in hand, flanked by 2 committee members who owed their positions to her patronage. Her posture was rigid, her smile tight, the kind that concealed unease beneath a polished veneer. One by one, agenda items passed: landscaping costs, seasonal decorations, minor complaints about noise. Then, as if on cue, Karen introduced the security concern she had raised 2 nights prior. She framed it as an act of community vigilance, speaking with exaggerated restraint about unanticipated occupancy and potential risks to property safety. But before her narrative could cement, I stepped forward. The flash drive containing my compiled footage slid across the table like a silent dagger. I had prepared the clips meticulously, the police cars idling under the lamplight, Karen pointing at my home while whispering to the officers, her repeated claims that the house might have been compromised, and finally, her own presence at my side gate on nights she had no reason to be there. Each frame was accompanied by timestamp logs from my security system, leaving no room for speculation. The room shifted. The committee members who had once nodded along to her statements now exchanged uneasy glances. Neighbors leaned forward in their folding chairs, their earlier skepticism replaced by dawning curiosity. What had been presented as a community safety issue was revealed, piece by piece, as a personal crusade built on presumption and overreach. Karen's expression tightened with every passing second of the playback. The facade of control began to crack, small fissures at first, a twitch of her jaw, a tap of her manicured nails against the table. She attempted to interject, to spin her actions as precautionary, but the footage was unrelenting. The officers, in their own reports, had marked the call as unfounded. My return had been legitimate, my property secure, and her allegations baseless. Whispers turned to murmurs, murmurs to pointed stares. A few residents began recalling their own experiences, the time Karen cited them for leaving their trash cans out for an extra hour, the unsanctioned inspections she had performed under the guise of safety, the notices slipped under doors without signatures or proper documentation. The illusion of her benevolent watch was dissolving in real time. By the time the final clip ended, the balance of the room had shifted entirely. The board, sensing the change in the air, moved to close the matter, not with the censure of my actions that Karen had likely intended, but with a formal admonishment against unnecessary escalation without cause. It was a diplomatic way of saying what everyone in the room already knew: she had abused her position. For the first time in years, Karen was on the defensive. In the days that followed, the ripple effect became a tide. Neighbors who once stayed silent began to speak up. Some filed their own complaints about her behavior. Others rallied for amendments to the HOA Charter, calling for stricter oversight of the board's powers. The newsletter, once a tool of quiet intimidation, became a forum for measured reform. Karen's power, once absolute, eroded not in a fiery confrontation but through the steady exposure of her methods. She still lived across the street, still paced her lawn with the same forced composure, but her calls were no longer heeded with unquestioning obedience. Her clipboard, once a symbol of authority, now drew wary glances and muffled chuckles. As for me, I resumed my life in the mansion I had worked hard to own, no longer concerned with the twitch of her curtains or the narrowing of her eyes. My cameras remained, not as tools of retaliation but as quiet sentinels, reminders that in a place obsessed with appearances, the truth is its own quiet rebellion. The police never returned. The notices stopped. The neighborhood, in time, found a new equilibrium, less perfect, perhaps, but freer. And every now and then, when I catch a glimpse of Karen standing by her porch with that same calculating stare, I am reminded that power in neighborhoods like this is rarely taken in one swift motion. It is eroded by persistence, by patience, and by the simple act of refusing to bend. The early return that had once been framed as a threat had, in the end, become the turning point the community didn't know it needed. The mansion stands as it always has, tall, quiet, and unbothered. And Karen, she still watches, but now, the neighborhood watches her back.